My pleasure tonight to introduce Julie Kim. Julie Kim earned her BA from Wellesley College and her MArch from MIT. She joined the Catholic University of America as Associate Professor in fall 2011. Her academic research and commissioned work seeks to amplify craft, making, and building, underpinned by questions of technology, the environment, culture, and gender. She seeks to maintain a balance between her research and creative efforts, operating as a licensed architect whose practice is intertwined with her role as an educator. In addition to her teaching responsibilities, she's the director of the Summer Institute for Architecture at Catholic, and in this role, she has led the development of several new summer programs, program initiatives, including a reintroduction of a robust summer speaker series. And I really encourage any of you who are in the DC area over the summer to attend these lectures. They're free and open to the public and really, really fantastic. She has also implemented a new summer studio series that is directed by internationally recognized architects, and these are the people who speak in that series, such as Nader Tarani, who we had visit us last semester when his work was on display, Billy Chen of Todd Williams and Billy Chen's office, and Ben Gilmartin from Diller Scafidio and Renfro's office. This summer, I believe that Enrique Norton and Andrea Steele will be coming, as well as Scott Lee from Morphosis. And again, those of you who are around this summer, check it out. Julie is the founder of C2 Architecture Studio, an award-winning design practice whose work has been recognized by the American Institute of Architects, both national and local chapters, the Society of American Registered Architects, and other peer-reviewed juries. She was invited and included as one of 12 architectural firms, included in Korean Architects Association, Young Korean Architects in the Global Context, and was also included in Architectural Records Emerging Architect Series in June 2010. Her current research efforts are focused on studying the relationship between the body and domestic space, and we're very fortunate to host the beautiful and intelligent results of this research project in our current Kaival Gallery exhibition. I'm struggling today, sorry. She is currently working on a book that offers a lens to view Detroit's potential through new urban landscapes, architectural provocations, and inherently optimistic acts of making and building. I've known Julie since we taught together at the University of Detroit Mercy in the mid-90s, and value her greatly as a colleague and a friend. My only regret, I have to say, Randy, is that she's teaching at Catholic and not here anymore, but I'm thrilled that she's once again in the DC area, and we can work together on many other collaborations. Please join me in welcoming Professor Julie Kim.
Thank you, Renate, for that kind introduction. I'd like to thank you and the community here at the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning, and Historic Preservation for the opportunity to share my work with you in the Kaival Gallery across the hall. I would also like to acknowledge the CUA students, many of whom are in the audience here, who helped me install the various pieces of that installation. I know I would not have been able to accomplish that without all of your help. So, before I start to talk about the work in the exhibition specifically, I wanted to take a few moments to share with you what interests, intrigues, and motivates my work. There are a series of what I call operative logics or themes that underpin the body of my efforts both in the professional studio as well as in the academic studio. So I will have a series of images that I'll just kind of rotate through as I speak. And these are the conceptual foundations of how I think about architecture, making, and building. There are four broadly defined themes. They are forming, patterning, stitching, and assembling. These threads sometimes overlap, and collectively they form a connective tissue that holds the work within a framework. So forming for me becomes a question of what is the form of the container and what is its relationship to that which is contained. This can be considered in several ways. Can we imagine a fluid and flexible construct that can adapt to multiple kinds of conditions? Or is it analog to the process of building a form, as you might with concrete, and is the formwork that renders the material its final shape? Or is it like a wrapper, in a way like a big body cloak that wraps the physical body to allow the architectural body to emerge? This then can segue into the second theme, which I call patterning. And patterning for me is translation, repetition. It's a seriality in considering topological surfaces that have been pinched, rippled, bifurcated, perforated, striated, or polar. And I began to wonder if we can consider these material logics and their implementation to reshape how we experience space. Or how might these reshape space itself? The pojagi is a traditional custom of wrapping gifts in Korean culture. It's a textile. But I see an opportunity to exploit its potential as a spatial surface, one that is rich, deep, and habitable. I think this could also relate back to forming in terms of what is a container and what is being contained. And so then this starts to lead to this question of the edge. Through this lens then, the articulation of this edge becomes a highly charged moment as a threshold between one condition and another. It's between what's inside versus what's outside. How can it both connect as well as separate? The edge in its thickness or its thinness then is a zone of reciprocity which both borrows and gives back. What is being contained? What is the container? This then leads to the third theme, and that is stitching. This thread explores the idea of the joint and the connective tissues at the multiple scales of building and city. I'm interested in the potential to transform, to agitate, to alter a built condition. And this can happen at both the neighborhood or the building scale. And then this can lead to further questions of adjacencies of materials, program, overlap, and overlay. What becomes interesting then for me to consider as well is how my work can operate in a speculative tension. Speculative in anticipating that next step, the tension articulated by an understanding of a past history that allows our current moves to be possible. This stitch can be seen then as the seam between two fragments of fabric. And again, fabric can be seen at multiple scales. It can be seen at the scale of the city, at the scale of the building, and certainly at the scale of the body. Finally then, the fourth theme brings it all together. And for me, that last theme is assembling. And this theme operates at the building scale and manifests itself as the investigation of the logic of spatial arrangements, of assemblages of program and space, and how these yield constructions in the act of building. Building as the verb, which is the action that leads to building as the noun, which is the consequence. So, stepping back to further contextualize here, I think architecture can be then considered as an agent of provocation. In turn, these provocations motivate the work. So these four very broadly defined themes shift positions from foreground to background, main text to subtext, ultimately shaping the way that I can begin to engage in a design process. So the project that I'm going to share with you now falls in these four, in the boundaries of all four, in stitching, forming, patterning, and assembling. The provocation here then is a question about the container and the contained, the dress and the body, the house and the family. The Hanbok and the abaya. These are both articles of clothing that have been designed to conceal the female body. The traditional Saudi Arabian dress, the abaya, and the Korean dress, the Hanbok, are both designed to conceal, to obscure, to cloak, and to render the female body opaque. This they hold in common. Their differences lie in that the abaya veils a wearer from head to toe, thereby denying the physical presence of the body. On the other hand, the Hanbok conceals the body by binding or wrapping it to camouflage the lines of the female figure. The result is the same. The feminine form in both cases is invisible. The abaya itself is a layered, veiled construct. It is the ultimate housecoat in that it is worn over street clothes. It's elegant, it's embroidered, but in its volume, the body disappears within the flowing robes. The hijab and the headscarf conceal all but the eyes. It is the ultimate disguise for the female body. While there is an option for a range of decorative trim elements, all women wearing it are actually rendered exactly the same. Body features are completely invisible. The Hanbok is different in the sense that it's a series of layers that starts with the undergarments, the underskirt, the overskirt, and then the jacket. And then slowly as the clothing is worn, the body disappears. The skirt in the Hanbok actually incorporates a band that flattens the breast of the wearer so that the body is completely denied within these bindings and wrappings. The shape of the wearer, too, is completely camouflaged within the voluminous skirt. So, you might be sitting there and asking, well, okay, well that's okay, pretty interesting, but what does clothing have to do with architecture? I believe that just as we wear our clothes on our physical bodies, there's a potential to consider our houses as an extension of our clothing. It's another skin. A tectonic skin, but it's another skin. So if we can accept this as the starting point, then the city or landscape can be seen as a continuation of that architectural circumstance. So via the vehicle of architecture then, our bodies are infinitely extended. So this research project seeks to make visible the relationship between the body, clothing, and architecture. Textiles wrap the physical body, tectonic skins enclose the architectural body. Before I could jump in and start designing an architectural response, though, it was important for me to establish an understanding of these two cultures and their homes. In fact, though, when I started the research, I wasn't really sure what I was going to find. So I started by just jumping in and examining programmatic and spatial relationships in the traditional Saudi home and then the traditional Korean home. By drawing this kind of comparative analysis, I was imagining that I would find all kinds of differences in how each of these manifests itself in the physical makeup of the house. As I diagrammed the historic and the traditional homes, what I found though were really interesting overlaps and similarities. Within these two very different cultural contexts, the Saudi and the Korean courtyard homes both give careful, similar consideration to how one experiences the homes, both physically and visually. Both have spaces designed for women only. And both homes historically, and the Saudi homes currently, still define zones of family or female space, as well as more formal zones for male space. So within these two very different cultural contexts, the Saudi and the Korean courtyard homes are both arranged as a series of carefully constructed spaces designed to deny or allow views and access. So to draw parallels to the dresses in both cultures, they too are carefully constructed articles of clothing. In Korean culture, Confucius principles drove the separations. In Saudi culture, Islamic principles continue to drive the separations. So the diagram that's up on the screen now is one that I created that's an abstraction of the relationship that can be found inside the traditional and the contemporary Saudi home. So you'll see the men's quarters that's defined in its space, and it's separated by a line from the female quarters that are defined in their space. Both spaces include a living area, which is called the majlis, and the men's space further has an additional living space called the mulhaq. So now looking at the diagram of a traditional Saudi home, the red line here in this diagram demarcates the actual building footprint, and the diagram itself reveals kind of major relationships within. There's a main entry courtyard that's accessed off the men's entry, and then the entry courtyard space then is further demarcated by a detached mulhaq, or sometimes it's called a diwaniyah space. It's typically used for male visitors for meeting to ensure separation from family life. This was really important to Saudi culture, to maintain that separation and privacy between public life of men and the private life of the family and of the women. Homes are also usually provided with a kind of formal living space for the men, which is called the majlis, which would then have access to a dining area. And the dining area operates as kind of a swing space. Family areas are provided with separation from the public areas, and sometimes are traditionally marked by a women's majlis, which is adjacent to the family entry, the women in the family entry. So there are two separate entries into this house around the corner from each other. The courtyards are somewhat connected, but how they access the house is maintained with separation. The vertical circulation then to the upper levels of the house are separated or screened from the public or the men's area of the home. I made a similar abstracted diagram for the relationships I found in the historical Korean home. You can see here as well that the men's quarters are defined in their space, and then the women's quarters are defined in their space as well, and they're separated by a line. Both spaces also include separate living areas, and here the women's space is further privatized by a space that's called the Hanbok. So now if we look at a diagram of a traditional Korean home, the entry courtyard space is marked by a main gate that's adjacent to the sarangchae. And the sarangchae is a traditional receiving room for men, and it's where men would entertain their guests. Sometimes in upper level homes there would also be a library room or a book room also for men. Only men were allowed to enter this area of the home. There would be a middle or a secondary gate which is provided for women to enter the courtyard privately with no possibility for interaction with men. The middle gate could lead someone from the men's quarters to the women's quarters, but then there was typically a wall built around the edge of the courtyard to avoid eye contact. So the result was that they could still hear each other, but they couldn't see each other. And that was important to maintain that visual separation. The Hanbok then that you can see in the women's quarters there in the upper left, the Hanbok is in the women's quarters, which is called the Anchae. This is the living space for the matriarch of the house. And so the Hanbok is the most private living space in the entire home. And if you were a man and you were not an immediate family member, you were strictly forbidden from entering this space. What's interesting here, though, was the fact that I started noticing a kind of spatial implication of this space. Is that from this space, the matriarch of the home would have direct visual connection to the kitchen and to the courtyard. So she could see everything, but she herself would not be seen. So for me, this seemed like an interesting parallel then to the idea of the veil. Behind the veil, you can see everything, but you can't be seen, in terms of a reference to Saudi culture. What I also further discovered as I was reading and doing my research was that most of the women's quarters were actually square. And so my research was telling me that the conventional square layout of the women's quarters was so that it could restrict women's sphere of activities and interactions. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. The space itself, the architecture is restrictive, just as the ceremonial Korean dress was designed as a way to restrict the physical body. Again, seeing this kind of relationship between the body and architecture. So then the fact that while all the other various living quarters were connected to each other within a kind of a walled compound, that the women's quarters was the only one that was enclosed on all four sides within the square shape. So the men's quarters in both the Saudi and the Korean homes are defined as separate spaces, and they further serve as a symbol of male position and power. Women in the inner quarters, men in the outer quarters. So we can place veiling in kind of in a historical context, and so I'm going to be a little bit facetious here because the historical context, of course, is that men sexually bothered women a lot, or maybe they were just sexually bothered by them. But in the end, is that the veiling was a mechanism of control that works to enclose women. We can acknowledge this. But what I found relevant to the work of the exhibit and the installation was the anonymity of the veiled women. They have no name. That said, they are physically present. On the inside looking out, they see everything without ever being recognized, and since they remain invisible, they are capable of making everything visible. That I thought was an interesting kind of realization for myself. So today, even when women travel in the open, they still confront the situation of having to veil themselves from the visibility of men who might be seen to undermine their reputation if they don't act appropriately around them. I noticed in my travels to the Middle East that when I saw women who were wearing the abaya and the hijab, that I would notice that they would tuck their headscarves, they would make sure that their hair was tucked in, or they would make sure that the abaya was giving them the proper coverage of their bodies. It was as if these coverings were forming a part of their own image. They serve as a reminder of what can't be forgotten, about historical ties between veiling and spatial movements. A woman's body image then could be understood then and positioned by cultural judgments, narratives, or rules. And then this in turn involves relationships between her body, the space in which she moves, and then the other objects and bodies that she encounters while moving. So then the woman's image then, it seems, is then a condition of her access to space and her plans for action and movement. For a basis of understanding, then, I also had to research Confucian cultural heritage to help me develop a critical framework or lens to understand how to view the nature of the Korean house. So I read a lot of writings of a range of Korean and Korean American scholars. They all spoke of kind of Confucian cultural heritage and how it continues to be deeply rooted and saturated in the daily lives of Koreans, even today. It provides political, social, and cultural meanings and functions in contemporary South Korea. Confucianism forms a core of Korean culture, and it remains the moral force with political power and social influence. This Korean moral fabric, then, that's woven together by family, school, and government, has a cohesive structure of Confucian ethics, which then affects the vertical and horizontal relationships of the social network. So in order to understand the roles, status, and the social positions of Korean women, you have to examine Confucianism, which is the basis of Korean cultural values and beliefs that have greatly impacted the life experiences of Korean women in family and in society. The Confucian heritage in South Korean society has contributed to cohesiveness in the family, excellence in education, and social harmony. Yet at the same time, it has perpetuated authoritarian, factional, and male-oriented ideas and practices. Most important elements of Confucian philosophy within a kind of historical context is the superiority and social position of women in society and in the family. So the social position of Korean men under traditional Confucianism is one that they were superior to women. According to Korean scholars, then, the traditional role for women involved reproduction, caretaking, nurturing, and homemaking. So yes, Western influx of culture, rapid industrialization, modernization, those have all weakened the influence of Confucian values over the last 50 years or so. Even still, though, and things are still changing, but even still, Confucianism remains deeply ingrained in the daily lives of Korean people. But it may be in an altered form. It still shapes and governs Korean beliefs, their values, their social interactions, family systems, and the cultural lives of many Koreans, as well as Korean immigrants in America. So the house, that I thought, could be seen in relationship to cultural inheritance. Confucianism emphasizing the chastity of women. The Hanbok emphasizes this by denying sexuality. Again, women are in the inner, men are on the outer. It's worth talking for a moment here about how you're even supposed to put on the Hanbok. The instructions are specific, and when we walk through the gallery, you'll see that they run around the space of the gallery space and around the installation. They include information like the waistband of the skirt should not be visible under the hemline of the jacket. Collar lines and shoulder seams should not appear in the backside. The chest should not be emphasized. Choose appropriate accessories. So both projects explore the relationship between the body, clothing, and architecture, and then so rooted then in this cultural and social understanding, the proposals seek to draw parallels between the Hanok, which is the historic Korean home, with the Hanbok, which is the ceremonial Korean dress, and with the contemporary Saudi home with the abaya and the hijab, the traditional Saudi Arabian dress. So I'd like to just take a moment here just to clarify that the investigations, they emerge from kind of a simple question I had about the connection between the female body and these articles of clothing. So the abaya in history, and then its continued daily wear today in contemporary Saudi culture, it suggested a way in which that I could take an understanding of a social, cultural, and spatial construct and the implications of that to import that into an articulation of a Saudi home that could in fact be built today. In fact, as sort of a side note, the house that I'm going to share with you, the Villa of Veils, we're actually in negotiations with a client to have it built in Saudi Arabia. So the abaya and the Villa of Veils becomes a more contemporary, current architectural circumstance. On the other hand, the Hanbok is not worn daily today. It's only worn for ceremonial occasions. The contemporary Korean homes today are not designed like the traditional and historic Hanbok were. So the architectural study for that house, Unwrapping the Hanbok, is more open-ended. I found that there is much more freedom in how the spaces and the relationships then emerge as a consequence of understanding the spatial sequence and layout of the traditional home, understanding the spatial sequence and layout of the Hanbok. So this study looks to understand the histories, the cultures, and the social context, and then develop a response to it. So the Unwrapping the Hanbok house doesn't in any way suggest it is a revision Hanok, or revision traditional Korean home. It seeks to unwrap the Hanbok and to get to that question between the female body and the architecture. So we can go back to the Villa of Veils first. The traditional typology of interiors in the Saudi houses reflects a profound sense of hierarchy between men and women, historically and today. It is a rigid issue of segregation between the sexes, which is echoed in the two entrances of the house, and is followed up in the interior by separating men's and women's quarters. The vertical circulation to the more private upper levels then are separated or screened from the public or men's area of the house. The degree of separation is further declared between servants and members of the family, and between the family and the outside world, by a series of increasingly private spaces which gravitate towards a central courtyard. Undoubtedly, a house like the Villa of Veils, the context that it would be built is not neutral, as it would be sited in a place like Riyadh. This is a place where political and religious leaders have potentially far more power over architecture than even the architects themselves. It was interesting that in my research, I was reading that the government actually razed a medieval settlement to the ground simply because the spatial complexity of the tight alleyways and the small squares created a problem of control for the authorities. So then I started thinking that it's not enough just to consider the programmatic requirements of the house, but to understand the house potentially as a political space, especially when you consider the issues of control. Where access is granted, where access is denied, how is it granted? How is it denied? Who can or who cannot move around freely? Who ultimately holds the control? So in designing the house, I started with the phrase visible invisibility. So what I meant by that was this condition of the both and. It was both visible and invisible simultaneously. I investigated the power of the gaze to determine the division of space within this home. From the most public area to the most private one, the eye is directed in a very specific path through different layers, either giving a full view or only a partial one, sometimes only implying what could be seen. At the entrance, a gate gives a view into the space of the courtyard, although a wall will penetrate the gaze from going any further. A 3-story volume arch defines the entry court threshold, and it wraps this public space. This arch shows kind of a dual aspect. It is both a formal one that articulates and defines the main public or male entry, and a metaphorical one of framing the gaze so as to give a hint of something else beyond. As one passes through the entrance then, we might introduce a series of cuts in the opening, in the edge of the wall, so that the presence of the unseen occupants could be signaled. Although internally the house follows a traditional layout of separating men's and women's quarters, the structure is broken by a few simple acts. We introduced a crack, a vertical cut in the wall of the women's entry that serves as a vantage point for surveying the unseen. That is the male domain. They are on the inside, looking out. They see everything without ever being recognized, and since they remain invisible, they make everything visible. Visible invisibility. So the internal arrangement of spaces in the house is organized in the traditional layout of specific male spaces separated from the family spaces on the ground floor. The dining room operates as a swing space, both as a joint to connect as well as to separate. The second level houses family spaces and private bedrooms with additional private space at the topmost level. Spaces on the east side of the house then offer viewing overlooks to the pool, which in this house we propose as a sunken courtyard. This is the most private family space. The views are oblique, and they reveal a space that is occupied by both men and women. The collective and individual gaze from both family and male spaces then are allowed to penetrate into the symbolic heart of the house. This house takes an attitude of questioning pre-established norms and conventions that have been taken for granted throughout history. Internal cuts in the walls of adjoining rooms are left without glass. These offer new possibilities. Some rooms can look outside through other rooms. Air can flow freely. No space is shut off completely. And so by offering a choice of different actions, the idea of privacy turns elastic. We are offering an alternative to the rigid separations that currently exist. So as I said, we're in negotiations to actually have this project move forward and to ultimately be built. I have to say, I don't know that I will share all of the thinking process with our client, as I don't know how well it will be received. So this will be my little secret. So while the Villa of Veils is designed according to the usual gender and class boundaries that's demanded by Muslim societies, I attempted to subvert these boundaries with gentle questions rather than formulating them in an obvious manner. So this is an architecture that goes beyond formalistic considerations. It introduces a certain ambiguity, which in turn initiates questions about social conditions and change. Unwrapping the Hanbok. So as I pointed out earlier, the Hanbok is not worn today on a daily basis, nor are contemporary Korean homes designed as the historic Hanok was. So the architectural study for this house emerges as a more open-ended investigation. Yes, I did need to understand the spatial and sequence and layout of traditional Korean homes, but it wasn't so that I could redesign a Hanok. I just needed to understand the historical and cultural and social context so that I could then develop kind of an intelligent, thoughtful response to it. So this proposal doesn't suggest that this is a revision Hanok or that we somehow redesign that. It's about looking for how might we really strike that relationship between the body, the clothing that she wears, and then the architecture. So Unwrapping the Hanbok is a study of the house as an articulation of the Korean dress. Unlike the conventional square courtyard as an organizing or a controlling mechanism, the square courtyard here in the house is a point of complete openness. Its intention is not to control, but it's to connect. The Hanbok house stretches across the landscape as the body extended. It is anchored by the central void space, which connects the horizontal spaces with a connection to the sky. The central anchoring space is the space that's identified in red in this image. And so the Hanbok house just asks the question whether the roles played by the traditional courtyard are still relevant. Can we challenge the formal and social concepts of the courtyard house? And so while we can understand and respect the framework of Confucian principles, this house invites us to develop what I call a selective amnesia. There's a certain amount of suspending disbelief that must happen when viewing the Hanbok house. Unlike the Villa of Veils, this design investigation is less about male or female segregations or connections. It finds its roots in trying to take all the layers of the Hanbok and to translate the ideas that are embedded in them and in the body consequence inside of them to develop an architectural circumstance. Because the Hanbok is not a daily worn garment, and because the Hanok is not the way that they design contemporary homes today, I had to take a different tactic in the study. So this house asks us to consider the idea of the courtyard as the body void, just as the body is rendered void in the Hanbok. The extensions of the house are zones of sensing, of movement, and of reach into the landscape, beyond the physical or the metaphorical body. The Korean dress symbolizes a strong identification with the Korean female and her subjectivity. I had earlier talked about the abaya as a social construct, one which serves as a constant reminder about what is permitted and what is denied. I had talked about how a woman's body image then becomes understood through or positioned by cultural judgments, narratives, or rules, and how this in turn involves a relationship between her body and the space in which she moves, and the other objects and bodies she encounters while moving. This is characteristic, too, of the Korean dress as a social construct. So unwrapping the Hanbok then specifically steers away from gender-specific space definitions. It is the body extended via an articulated skin and envelope. So therefore, the relationships are with the wall, with the floor, and with the sky. Or, in other words, with what's next to, what's below, and what's above. What's inside, what's outside. Keeping with the traditional basis of harmony with nature, the proposed Hanbok house curates views into and out of the house. The northern face, the main entry, is defined by an entry court which is flanked by a heavy wall with careful incisions to impart a sense of scale. A pojagi layer of an articulated skin wraps this edge. It operates as a spatial surface, defining the zone of threshold. Upon entry, one sees a central void space, again that space in red, with an oculus to the sky. Its base is defined by both the horizontal and the vertical axis. This is the connective space between the public and the private spaces of the home. Lines and planes are also significant. A space dominated by horizontal lines is said to evoke a sense of calm and peace. And while oblique lines can suggest instability and imbalance, they can also provide a stimulating sense of liveliness and anticipation. So this house incorporates both the horizontal and the oblique. The central space then, the body void, serves as an anchor and offers that space unobstructed. In its emptiness, it holds presence. Articulating the house coat, or bridging architecture and installation. The dress in both cultures binds or wraps the body. Conceptually, the woman wears her house. The two theoretical architectural studies, they study the idea of the void spaces that can amplify and reveal the presence of the body. The Hanbok is a series of layers that starts with the underskirt and then layers are added on top. There is a band that wraps the breast tightly, denying the lines of the female figure. With a Hanbok, multiple layers of fabric conceal the body, rendering it absent. The house, too, is a series of layered spaces, each one carefully constructed to only allow specific views. Unwrapping the Hanbok reveals the body as a void space, both connected to the earth and sky simultaneously. At this moment, the zones of binding, of extending, and of sensing collide as manifestations of the multiple layers of the dress. Inspired by the pojagi, this architectural proposal is too draped by an articulated, transparent, and punctuated envelope. The house is an expression of the female body infinitely extended. The abaya is a layered construction of fabrics too. Women wear the abaya on top of their own clothes. They cloak the figure in black then, the ultimate disguise. When I wore the abaya, it was both unnerving and liberating simultaneously. I felt as if I no longer had an accountable presence. That said, in my invisibility, I became more aware of my own body and myself, as well as my movements. So the Villa of Veils expresses this inextricably tied relationship between the abaya and the physical threshold of the house. Upon entry, the woman who's wearing the abaya, she can take the abaya off. The house then becomes her veil. The home establishes then careful and clear distinctions between male and female spaces of the home. Just as the abaya controls the view, the spaces of the home both deny and allow access between specific conditions. So the series of architectural studies considers how the physical body is expressed via the articulated house coat. There is no right or wrong way to engage with the work of the exhibition or the installation. It, like the investigations, are open-ended and intentionally ambiguous. The installation invites you to enter its construct of simultaneously veiled, contained, and wrapped spaces. The installation piece of the courtyard, of the containers, recalls the courtyard as well as the traditional dress of Saudi and Korean culture. The courtyard gives presence to the body. The containers control how you are viewed and what you view. The white obscures the view, the black allows it. The containers demarcate the edges, and from their arrangement and logic, the central courtyard space emerges as a consequence. I was interested in describing a situation where the body was rendered absent within the containers. It becomes a circumstance of disembodied voices. At some point, you can no longer see the person inside the threads, but you can still hear them. So the interference with the gaze heightens one's sense of presence and self. The containers incorporate ideas that are central to the work, including sequence, access, and boundaries, controlling movement, controlling views. Both the installation and the architectural proposals explore and seek to unwrap notions of gender and women's space, ultimately rendering the body present.